It all started with a flat tire. I was driving home from a long day at work, the kind of day where the minutes felt like hours and the hours felt like an eternity. My head was pounding, my stomach was growling, and all I wanted was to collapse onto my couch and forget the world existed. But as I drove past the dimly lit side of a back road, I saw her. She was standing by an old sedan with its hood popped open, waving her arms like a castaway stranded on a deserted island. It was late November, cold enough to see your breath in the air, and she wasn't wearing a coat. I almost kept driving. In fact, I did for about 20 feet before I slammed on the brakes and cursed under my breath. Something about the desperation in her face tugged at me. Against my better judgment and a voice in my head screaming about stranger danger, I turned around. Her name was Marcy. She looked to be in her late 20s, with a pale, tired face and dark circles under her eyes that told a story of sleepless nights. Her car was a wreck, one of the tires completely shredded, and it was clear she didn't have a spare. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice shaky but warm. "You're the first person who even looked my way." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Do you have someone you can call?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really." Something about her answer made me pause. There was an edge to it, a vulnerability she was trying to hide. I knew I should have just called her a tow truck, but instead, I offered to drive her to the nearest gas station. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. The ride was awkward at first. Marcy stared out the window, occasionally giving me directions to the station. But as we sat in the silence, I couldn't help but notice the faint smell of cigarettes and something else, like cheap air freshener trying to mask something more unpleasant. "Rough day?" I asked, attempting to break the ice. She let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that." As we talked, bits of her story began to unravel. She'd recently lost her job, fallen behind on rent, and was essentially living out of her car. The shredded tire was just the latest in a series of unfortunate events. I didn't know what to say. Her situation felt so far removed from my own cushy, albeit monotonous, life. But there was something about the way she spoke, proud but resigned, that made me want to help. When we got to the gas station, I insisted on buying her a meal from the convenience store. At first, she refused, but her hunger eventually won out. As she ate, I told her about myself, a mid-level office worker with a boring routine and a life that felt painfully predictable. She laughed at my self-deprecation, and for a moment, the heaviness between us lifted. That could have been the end of it, but as I watched her walk back to her car, something stopped me. Before I could overthink it, I called out, "Do you have a plan for tonight?" She turned, eyebrows raised. "Not really." "Let me help you," I blurted. "I can get you a room for the night. It's not much, but at least you'll be warm." Her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she'd refuse. But then she nodded, and I felt a strange sense of relief. What started as a one-time gesture turned into something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, I found myself checking in on Marcy, helping her with small things, getting her car fixed, finding job listings, and even lending her my old laptop. It wasn't charity, it felt more like a partnership. In return, she taught me things I didn't even realize I needed to learn. She had a way of seeing the world that was raw and unfiltered. She didn't sugarcoat her struggles, but she didn't wallow in them either. She was fiercely independent, even in the face of overwhelming odds. One night, over cheap pizza in my apartment, she said something that stuck with me. "People think I'm some tragic story, but I'm just me. Life is messy, and we all get lost sometimes. It doesn't mean we're broken." Over time, Marcy got back on her feet. She found a job at a local diner, saved up enough to rent a small studio, and even started taking community college classes. Watching her rebuild her life was nothing short of inspiring. But our friendship wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of tension, times when I overstepped, thinking I knew what was best for her, or when she pushed me away, needing space to figure things out on her own. Despite those moments, we remained close. She became more than just a stranger I'd helped, she became one of my closest friends. It's been 3 years since that night on the side of the road. Marcy is now finishing her degree in social work, determined to help others who've faced hardships like hers. As for me, I've learned that life isn't about grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes, it's about the small, seemingly insignificant decisions, the ones that lead you to stop on the side of the road and change someone's life. Looking back, I can't imagine what my life would look like if I hadn't stopped for Marcy that night. She taught me the value of compassion, the power of resilience, and the beauty of taking a chance on someone, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. So, if you ever find yourself in a position to help someone, even if it's just offering them a warm meal or a kind word, don't hesitate. You might just end up changing both of your lives in the process. Second story. Growing up, my family was pretty ordinary, or at least that's what I thought. We had our quirks, sure, but nothing that screamed hidden drama or family secrets. My parents were practical, hard-working people, and they raised me to believe that our family history was straightforward. That's why what happened during one random weekend last year completely blindsided me. It all began with an invitation. My friend Jordan had been raving about this small, picturesque town called Willow Springs, about 3 hours from where we lived. He'd been there for a work retreat and insisted I had to see it for myself. "You'll love it," he said. "It's got all these vintage shops, amazing food, and this little antique store that's basically a treasure chest." I wasn't particularly into antiques, but I was in dire need of a break. Work had been draining, and I felt like I was running on fumes. So, I packed a bag and agreed to tag along for a weekend escape. The drive to Willow Springs was uneventful but relaxing. Rolling hills, quiet roads, and the kind of scenery that makes you want to ditch your phone and just exist. When we arrived, Jordan's enthusiasm made sense. The town was charming in every way. Cobblestone streets, colorful storefronts, and an air of tranquility you don't find in the city. On our second day there, we wandered into the antique shop Jordan had mentioned. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow alley, its sign barely visible under a canopy of ivy. Inside, the shop was a maze of old furniture, dusty books, and shelves crammed with knickknacks. As Jordan browsed, I wandered to a corner filled with old photographs and documents. There was something fascinating about sifting through other people's memories, wedding photos from the 50s, postcards with faded handwriting, birth certificates. And then I saw it. Tucked between a stack of yellowed papers was a black and white photograph of a man who looked eerily familiar. His jawline, his eyes, even the way he held himself, it was like staring at an older version of myself. I picked up the photo, my heart pounding. On the back, someone had written James H. C. 1947, Willow Springs in neat cursive. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who was this man? Why did he look so much like me? The shop owner, a friendly older woman named Elaine, noticed my reaction. "Found something interesting?" she asked. I showed her the photo and asked if she knew anything about it. She squinted at it, then smiled. "Ah, James. He used to live here, back in the day." Fascinating man, though a bit of a recluse. I pressed her for more details, and she explained that James had been a writer who moved to Willow Springs after World War II. He was well known in the town for his vivid storytelling, but had passed away decades ago, leaving no known family behind. The resemblance was too uncanny to ignore. I texted my mom a picture of the photo, asking if she recognized him. Her response came almost immediately, *, "Where did you find this?" *, it turned out that James H. C. wasn't just some random man, I was related to him. He was my great-grandfather's brother, someone my family had never spoken about. When I called my mom to ask why, her voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. "There are things about our family that we don't talk about," she said. James was complicated. He made choices that didn't sit well with the family back then. She wouldn't elaborate, but the conversation left me with more questions than answers. I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few weeks, I dove into every resource I could find about James. I discovered that he had written several unpublished manuscripts, some of which were stored in a local historical society. I reached out to them, explaining my connection, and they allowed me to visit and review his work. Reading his stories was like stepping into another world. His writing was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. He wrote about love, loss, and the struggles of reintegration after the war. But what struck me the most were the subtle hints about family, fractured relationships, unresolved conflicts, and the pain of feeling like an outsider. One passage, in particular, stood out: "Blood binds us, but it also burdens us. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is to walk away so others can thrive." I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was James writing about himself? Did he leave the family intentionally, believing it was for the best? When I brought my findings to my mom, she finally opened up. James had been estranged from the family after a bitter argument with his father. Details were scarce, but it seemed to revolve around James' refusal to take over the family business. He wanted to pursue writing, a choice his father saw as irresponsible. Back then, things were different, my mom said. Family loyalty was everything. James was seen as a traitor for choosing his own path. It was heartbreaking to think about. James wasn't just a ghost in our family history, he was a man who had been cast out for daring to follow his dreams. The experience changed me. It made me question how we define loyalty and what it means to honor our family while staying true to ourselves. It also made me realize the importance of understanding where we come from, even if the stories aren't always pretty. James may have been forgotten by our family, but I've made it my mission to ensure his story lives on. I've started compiling his manuscripts, with the hope of publishing them someday. It feels like the least I can do for a man who sacrificed so much for his passion. That weekend in Willow Springs wasn't just a getaway, it was a journey into the heart of my family's history and a reminder that even the most unexpected detours can lead to profound discoveries. Third story. Last summer, I found myself with more free time than I knew what to do with. Work had slowed down, and most of my friends were out of town. I was restless, scrolling endlessly on my phone, looking for something, anything, that might shake me out of my rut. That's when I saw a post in the community group for my neighborhood. Volunteers needed for community cleanup. Saturday at 10 a.m. Meet at Maplewood Park. Help us clean up and make our neighborhood beautiful again. I hesitated for a moment before hitting the RSVP button. I wasn't exactly an eco-warrior, but the idea of doing something productive and maybe meeting new people seemed appealing. When Saturday rolled around, the turnout was better than I expected. Around 30 people showed up, ranging from teenagers to retirees. Everyone was armed with gloves, trash bags, and a surprising amount of enthusiasm. The project started simple, picking up litter along the park trails and clearing out overgrown brush. I paired up with an older man named Frank, who seemed to know everyone. He had a story for every corner of the park: the old playground that was replaced 10 years ago, the time the local softball team won a championship here in the 80s. As we worked our way toward a cluster of abandoned benches, I noticed something odd. Beneath the tangled vines and dirt, there was a small metal box, rusted and barely visible. "Hey, Frank," I called out, "look at this." He squinted and chuckled. "You've got an eye for treasure, kid. Let's see what's inside." The box was surprisingly heavy. With some effort, we pried it open, revealing a collection of old letters, photographs, and what looked like a journal. Everything was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was clear that this wasn't just trash. A group of volunteers gathered around as we spread the contents out on one of the cleaner benches. The letters were dated from the 1960s and were addressed to someone named Rose. The journal, written in neat, looping cursive, seemed to belong to her as well. Curiosity got the better of me. After the cleanup ended, I asked if I could take the box home to try and preserve its contents. Frank gave me a knowing smile. "Looks like you've got a mystery on your hands," he said. That evening, I carefully dried the papers and began to piece together the story. Rose, as it turned out, was a young woman who lived in the neighborhood during the 1960s. Her journal was filled with thoughts about her life, mundane details about her job at the local diner, her dreams of becoming a writer, and a budding romance with someone named Elliot. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Rose wrote about feeling trapped, about secrets she couldn't share with anyone. Her last journal entry was dated June 12, 1968, *, I hope Elliot understands why I have to leave. It's not safe here anymore. Maybe someday, I'll be able to explain everything. The letters to Rose were from Elliot, full of heartbreak and confusion. He begged her to come back, to tell him what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Over the next few days, I dove into research, digging through old newspaper archives and even visiting the local library. I learned that Rose had vanished shortly after her final journal entry. There were no reports of foul play, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. Frank was my next stop. When I told him what I'd found, his face grew serious. I remember Rose, he said quietly. She was a sweet girl, but her family, well, let's just say they were very private. There were rumors back then, but nobody ever confirmed anything. What kind of rumors? I pressed. He hesitated before replying, that her father was mixed up in some shady business. People said she left to protect herself, or maybe to protect Elliot. The more I uncovered, the more I felt connected to Rose's story. I decided to try and find Elliot, hoping he might have answers. With the help of a local historian, I tracked down an address for an Elliot Saunders, who still lived nearby. When I knocked on his door, an elderly man with kind eyes answered. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. When I mentioned Rose's name, his expression softened. I never stopped thinking about her, he said. Elliot told me that he had spent years searching for Rose, but eventually, the trail went cold. He never married, always holding out hope that she might return. When I showed him the letters and journal, he was quiet for a long time. Then, he looked at me and said, "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Elliot and I worked together to piece together Rose's story. Through old records and some lucky connections, we discovered that she had moved to another state and started a new life. She had changed her name and left no trace of her past. It turned out that her father had been involved in organized crime, and when she found out, she feared for her safety and Elliot's. Leaving was her way of protecting them both. Though she passed away years ago, her story found closure. Elliot visited her grave, and we worked with the local historical society to preserve her journal and letters as part of the neighborhood's history. That summer, what started as a simple cleanup turned into a journey I'll never forget. Rose's story reminded me of the power of community, of the secrets that bind us, and the importance of preserving the past. To this day, I think about her whenever I walk through Maplewood Park. It's not just a park anymore, it's a place filled with stories, waiting to be uncovered.